Hey guys, tonight we're going to trace the full, tangled, surprising story of how the United States of America went from a scattered group of colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast to becoming the most powerful nation on Earth. This isn't just a timeline, it's a journey through wars, inventions, accidents, bold moves, and moments when things could have gone completely differently. And yes, it's all one continuous story. It doesn't just end with America won, it asks how and why. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with 13 colonies, not exactly glamorous. These were not rich places. They were muddy, improvised, and incredibly spread out. They didn't speak with one voice. In fact, they barely spoke with one another. The colonies had different economies, religions, and reasons for existing at all. Georgia was practically a debtor's colony. Massachusetts was built by religious dissidents. Virginia wanted land and profit, uniting them under one flag. That was not the plan, and yet, something shifted. At first it was anger, about taxes, yes. But deeper than that, the British Crown was starting to feel less like a distant monarch and more like an overbearing landlord. Laws kept rolling in from across the sea, telling the colonists how to trade, where to settle, and what not to say. It didn't feel like partnership, it felt like control, and Americans, though they didn't call themselves that yet, had started to taste independence. The tipping point: Britain tried to tax paper, tea, glass, and just about anything else that touched everyday life. People were furious, but not just because of the money. It was about permission. Being taxed without a voice in Parliament felt like a clear sign. They were subjects, not citizens. And so they protested. They dumped tea into harbours. They boycotted British goods. And eventually they picked up guns. The American Revolution officially began in 1775, but the mood had been building for years. The colonists were outgunned, undertrained, and pretty disorganized. Britain had the biggest navy on Earth, a seasoned army, and the money to hire more soldiers from Europe. On paper, the rebellion looked like a short-term problem for the British, a nuisance. But geography worked against the empire. Commanding troops across the Atlantic was slow and frustrating. Orders arrived weeks late, troops marched into the wrong towns, colonists fought in forests, not open fields, using guerrilla tactics that irritated the redcoats endlessly. Then came one of the biggest turning points, the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. It wasn't just a military win, it proved to other nations that the rebels had a shot. France, still bitter after losing territory to Britain in previous wars, saw its chance. The French sent money, weapons, troops, and crucially ships. The revolution became international. That support turned the tide. Eventually, in 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. 2 years later, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. But here's where many history books pause, and tonight, we're not doing that, because this is where the real transformation starts. One mainstream historical fact: America's government after the war was barely functioning. The Articles of Confederation created a federal system that was too weak to collect taxes, regulate trade, or even pay soldiers. States acted like independent countries. The economy floundered, rebellions popped up. The country had won its independence, but it hadn't figured out how to use it. So, in 1787, leaders met in secret to try again. The result was the US Constitution, short, flexible, and full of compromise. It created a stronger federal government, divided power into branches, and established a president who wasn't a king, but had real authority. George Washington took the job, reluctantly, but seriously. From here, things began to settle, but only just. America was fragile. It was deeply in debt. It had enemies abroad, and no guarantee it could hold together. Many thought it would break apart. Even Benjamin Franklin joked that the new republic might last only a few years. Historians still argue whether the Constitution was designed for democracy or for elite control with a democratic flavor. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the world watched. Some monarchs hoped the US would collapse. proving that rule by the people was a cute but impractical idea. Others were nervous. If this America survived, it might inspire rebellions elsewhere. And it did. The French Revolution followed just years later, with its own chaos and bloodshed. The idea of people governing themselves, without a crown, was out in the world. The United States wasn't just surviving now, it was influencing. Here's a quirky fact. One of the first things the new Congress debated was how to address the president. Should it be, His Excellency, Your Highness? They eventually settled on the plain, Mr. President. It was simple, Republican, and kind of revolutionary in its own way, so that's where our story begins. Not with greatness, but with a gamble, a fragile country, holding itself together with parchment and hope. But the foundation was set, and with it, a pathway to power that no one in 1776 could have imagined. As soon as the ink dried on the Treaty of Paris, the United States did what many newborn nations do. It immediately started picking fights with its own future, because while the war was over, the real challenge had just begun. What kind of country was this going to be? One thing was clear, it wasn't staying small. Even before the Constitution was fully ratified, Americans had a hunger for land that can only be described as alarming. And this wasn't just about farming, it was psychological. Expanding westward wasn't just a goal, it was a national obsession, practically a spiritual belief. They called it manifest destiny, a phrase that would come later but fit the mood perfectly. The idea that the US was meant to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now in the 1780s and 90s, that dream was still a map full of question marks. The Appalachian Mountains were the wild edge of civilization. Beyond that, forests, plains, rivers, and indigenous nations who'd been there long before the word America was ever whispered. The first big break came in 1803, with a deal that makes modern real estate agents cry tears of joy, the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon, in need of cash and overextended in the Caribbean, sold France's entire claim to a massive chunk of North America for about 4 cents an acre. Thomas Jefferson, president at the time, jumped at the offer, even though the Constitution didn't technically say he could do that. He did it anyway. The purchase doubled the size of the US overnight. Just imagine the vibe. One day you're a middling coastal republic. The next day you own land stretching to the Rocky Mountains. No GPS, no maps, no clue what's actually out there. Jefferson immediately sent out Lewis and Clark, who spent years canoeing, trading, freezing, climbing, and sometimes just guessing their way through unexplored territory. Mainstream historical fact. The Louisiana Purchase added over 800,000 square miles to the US. It was the bargain of the century, and a bold flex in a world of monarchies that weren't used to countries suddenly doubling in size. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This expansion wasn't empty. Indigenous nations lived across all of it. They had governments, languages, and economies of their own. But to the growing US, these societies were in the way. Conflict was inevitable, and it got brutal. Some treaties were signed, many were broken. Battles flared, tribes were pushed, relocated, or wiped out. The Trail of Tears wasn't some isolated event, it was part of a much broader pattern of removal and erasure. Expansion made the US bigger, but it also made it cruel. Historians still argue whether this westward push was strategic genius or ethical collapse, probably both. Meanwhile, another thing was expanding: cotton. The Deep South discovered that cotton grew very well in its soil, and the global textile industry wanted as much of it as possible. But cotton required massive labor, so slavery, already present, exploded. Enslaved people were sold, transported, and forced to work on a scale that fueled not just Southern wealth, but the entire US economy. Banks, insurance companies, shipping firms all profited from slavery. Quirky detail. In the early 1800s, New York City was one of the biggest hubs for cotton finance. Even though New York itself had banned slavery, Northern money and Southern plantations were tightly linked, and nobody liked to talk about it. As expansion continued, new states were added to the Union, but with each new state came the same haunting question: would it allow slavery? That tension simmered quietly for decades, like watching someone dance on a frozen lake and pretending the ice isn't cracking. Every new piece of land, whether from treaty, purchase or war, threatened to tip the balance. The US even went to war with Mexico in 1846. The cause? Officially, border disputes. Unofficially, land hunger. The US won decisively and gained what's now California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and parts of other states. Again, just absorbed, like America had turned into a very confident Roomba. By 1850, the country had grown from a rebellious coastline to a continental colossus. The Pacific was now the western shore. Railroads were starting to crawl across the map. Immigrants were pouring in by the thousands. Gold had been discovered in California, and people were racing west with wagons, hopes, and wildly unrealistic expectations. But growth had a cost. Every mile westward widened the gap between north and south. Industry versus agriculture, free labor versus slavery, federal power versus state rights. It was no longer just a matter of whether America could rule its own territory. It was a question of whether it could rule itself. Still, by the mid-19th century, the US had done something most countries never pull off. In just 70 years, it had transformed from colonial startup to continental force. No one called it a superpower yet, but other nations were starting to look sideways and mutter, "Getting big." And big, as history shows, almost always gets hungry. The year is 1861, and the United States of America is on fire from the inside. The cracks that had been spreading for decades finally split the country in two. The Confederacy forms in the South, the Union holds in the North, and the bloodiest war in American history begins. Not over a border dispute, not because of foreign invasion, but because of a fundamental, unresolved contradiction at the heart of the Republic. Could a nation founded on liberty survive with slavery still stitched into its skin? This wasn't just a domestic disaster. The entire world was watching. Monarchs, merchants, and military men in Europe eyed the chaos with a mix of fascination and schadenfreude. After all, this great experiment in democracy looked like it was failing loudly. And in public, mainstream historical fact, over 600,000 people died during the Civil War. That's more than all other American wars combined, until the Vietnam era. Fields became graveyards, cities burned, families literally fought on opposite sides. It was carnage, and it was transformative. But in the middle of all this destruction, something else happened. The war turned the United States from a fragile, half-formed republic into a centralized industrial nation. That shift, gritty, unintended, and born of necessity, set the foundation for America's rise to global dominance. Let's break it down. First, the war supercharged industry. The North, with its factories, railroads, and telegraph lines, went into overdrive. It mass-produced weapons, uniforms, canned food, ironclads, and rail cars. What had been a scattered manufacturing economy suddenly scaled into something vast and lethal. The government didn't just buy supplies, it reshaped the entire economy around wartime efficiency. Railroads were the arteries of war, and the Union learned to use them like no military before. Soldiers could move faster. Supplies could reach battlefields in days instead of weeks. The sheer logistics of it all was staggering, and it taught the US government how to move a nation on command. Telegraphs clicked out news and orders in real time, or close to it, which meant Lincoln could communicate with generals hundreds of miles away. That was brand new. For the first time in history, a war could be commanded from a central desk. That changed everything. Quirky but true. Abraham Lincoln became obsessed with the telegraph. He spent hours in the War Department's telegraph office, waiting for updates, sometimes sleeping there. He wasn't just reading messages, he was watching the future of warfare unfold in Morse code. Now, let's talk about global perception. Britain and France flirted with the idea of supporting the Confederacy. Why? Because Southern cotton powered their textile mills. But after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, everything changed. Supporting the Confederacy now meant supporting slavery, out loud, on the record. And Europe wasn't ready to risk that level of public blowback. So the Union got stronger diplomatically, while the Confederacy became increasingly isolated. Historians still argue, Whether Lincoln's primary goal was abolition or preserving the Union, probably both. But regardless of intent, the result was seismic. Slavery ended. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, legally abolished it across the United States. That single move, imperfectly implemented, constantly resisted, reshaped the country forever. And here's the thing, war changes scale. The United States, after the Civil War, wasn't just bigger, it thought bigger. The federal government had taken on unprecedented power. It had taxed, conscripted, confiscated, built, and governed like never before. And it didn't just stop doing that when the war ended. America, for the first time, felt like a nation with momentum. Brutal momentum, sure, but momentum nonetheless. Another transformation, citizenship. The 14th Amendment made anyone born in the US a citizen. That included formerly enslaved people. It didn't guarantee equality, not by a long shot, but it planted the legal seed for future civil rights battles. The idea that your rights came from being American, not from property or pedigree, was a radical shift, and it would echo globally. Meanwhile, the South lay in ruins. Its economy shattered, its cities scorched. Reconstruction began, a messy, heartbreaking attempt to rebuild the region and integrate millions of newly freed people into a society that had violently opposed their freedom. Progress was made, then rolled back, then made again. The country moved forward, but with deep scars. And here's a weird side effect. As the US stitched itself back together, its industries didn't slow down, they sped up. Factories built for war shifted to railroads, steel, oil, and textiles. By the 1870s, America was no longer a regional power. It was a rising economic force. Immigrants poured in, cities swelled, and quietly, without empire or conquest. Yet, the US started becoming a country the world couldn't ignore. Foreign investors took note. American exports jumped, and by the time you hit the 1880s, Wall Street was already causing financial waves in London and Paris. So yes, the Civil War was a national trauma, but it was also the catalyst that made modern America possible. The nation that emerged wasn't just intact, it was more industrial, more centralized, and more ambitious than ever before. The spark of rebellion had grown into a furnace. By the time the dust settled after the Civil War, America had done something most nations don't pull off even after centuries. It had completely reinvented itself. Not by choice, not cleanly, but it had become something new. The next few decades, think of it like puberty for a country. Loud, awkward, bursting with energy, and occasionally horrifying. Welcome to the age of steel, sweat, and stunning ambition. From the 1870s through the early 1900s, the United States became a machine, literally and metaphorically. Railroads stitched the nation together, connecting farms to cities, mines to ports, and people to new possibilities. By 1900, over 90,000 miles of track had been laid, enough to wrap around the Earth more than 7 times. That's not an economy, that's an obsession. And railroads weren't just transportation, they were power. Whoever controlled the rails, controlled commerce, and the men who controlled the rails, titans, tycoons, sometimes flat-out cartoon villains. Mainstream historical fact. This was the Gilded Age. The economy boomed, cities exploded with growth, and a handful of men made money so fast it practically defied physics. Names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt weren't just rich. They redefined what rich even meant. But let's not romanticize it too much. The wealth came from ruthless efficiency and brutal exploitation. Workers toiled in mines and factories for pennies. Child labor was everywhere. Unions were rare, often crushed by force. The streets glittered for the wealthy, while the rest of the city coughed through soot and tenement fires. Quirky detail: in New York, there were so many horses pulling carts that the city produced an estimated 2.5 million pounds of manure per day. That's what powered commerce before internal combustion, literal horsepower, and the mountain of poop that came with it. Meanwhile, immigrants poured in from Europe. Irish, Italians, Poles, Germans, Jews, all chasing the American dream, or at least a better life than the one they left behind. Ellis Island became the country's gateway. The Statue of Liberty was erected in 1886 and instantly became a beacon, even though no one seemed to have told her that rent would get ridiculous within a century. Back to the power players. Andrew Carnegie made his fortune in steel. His factories didn't just build bridges and rail lines. They built cities, and when Carnegie sold his company to J.P. Morgan in 1901, it became U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. One company, richer than some nations, John D. Rockefeller took a different route: oil. His company, Standard Oil, eventually controlled over 90% of the U.S. oil industry. That's not a typo, and he did it with vertical integration, owning not just the oil, but the barrels, the shipping, the refineries. The guy was a one-man pipeline. And then there was the rail king, Cornelius Vanderbilt. He started with steamships, then railroads, and ended up building a fortune so huge it makes modern billionaires look like they're just running a really successful Etsy shop. But power like that doesn't go unchecked forever. Public backlash grew. Muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell exposed the tactics behind the wealth bribery, sabotage, price manipulation. The federal government started getting nervous. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed to break up monopolies, but enforcement was, let's say, selective. Historians still argue whether the government truly wanted to rein in big business, or just wanted to look like it cared. Meanwhile, cities were booming. Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, skyscrapers began rising. Elevators changed everything, and electric lights made the night feel optional. Everything was getting faster, bigger, and loud. Here's where things get subtly world-shaping. America's domestic dominance started bleeding outward. US companies began looking for overseas markets. Investors started eyeing foreign resources. The idea that the US might not just be a nation but a global player started taking root. Even the military began modernizing. The Navy went from rusty leftovers to sleek steel battleships. This wasn't just about defense, it was about projection. America was getting ready to step onto the world stage. And yet, politically, the country was cautious. The scars from the Civil War were still raw. The idea of getting involved in global affairs felt risky, even offensive to some. Isolationism remained a strong instinct. Many Americans believed in expansion, just not entanglement. But here's the tension. You can't build a global economy and pretend you don't need global influence. That contradiction was brewing. And culturally, America was becoming addictive. Ragtime, vaudeville, dime novels, early cinema. US culture was messy, fast, and captivating. Even overseas, people started noticing. This wasn't the highbrow art of Europe. It was popcorn storytelling, catchy music, street-level magic, and it would only grow stronger. In short, by the end of the 19th century, the US was a sleeping colossus. Its body was huge, its appetite growing, and its eyes, though still partly shut, were starting to glance outward. The next step, empire. And America was about to stumble into it. As the 20th century blinked awake, the United States stood at a crossroads, with one foot planted firmly in its isolationist past, and the other creeping, maybe accidentally, toward global empire. And like a teenager trying to act cool at a party, America didn't quite admit what it was doing. But make no mistake, expansion was happening. Let's zoom in on one of the strangest turning points in US history, the Spanish-American War of 1898. Also known as that short war, where America woke up with colonies and wasn't entirely sure how. Here's the setup. Cuba, a Spanish colony, was in the middle of a rebellion. The US had business interests there, but also an emerging sympathy for Cuban independence. American newspapers, in full-blown yellow journalism mode, started painting the conflict in wild colors, complete with exaggerated atrocities and calls for moral intervention. It was basically tabloid war hype, and it worked. Then came the spark. The USS Maine, an American battleship docked in Havana Harbor, exploded under mysterious circumstances. Over 260 men died. To this day, historians still argue whether it was sabotage, accident, or something in between. But the headlines screamed one message: remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Congress declared war, and in just a few months, it was over. Spain, weak, overextended, and running low on empire, surrendered. The US suddenly had control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba was technically independent, but heavily under American influence. Mainstream historical fact: this war lasted just 10 weeks. But it catapulted America into the global empire game almost overnight. And that's where things got awkward. The Philippines, for example, wasn't thrilled to be liberated only to be colonized by a new power. Filipino revolutionaries who had been fighting Spain now had to fight the US. The Philippine-American War followed, lasting years and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. It was brutal, ugly, and mostly forgotten in mainstream American memory. Probably because it complicates the whole freedom and democracy narrative. But make no mistake, the US was now in the empire business. Back at home, President William McKinley explained it with a famously strange quote. He said he prayed on what to do with the Philippines, and decided that God wanted America to educate the Filipinos, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. The twist: the Philippines was already mostly Catholic, so, thanks. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the US didn't just hang around Cuba, it started building influence across the region. The Caribbean was seen as America's backyard, and Washington wanted it secure. Enter Theodore Roosevelt. Now Roosevelt had already made a name for himself charging up San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders, a story so glorified it borders on historical fan fiction. But what he really brought was energy. He became president in 1901, after McKinley was assassinated, and he wasted no time making it clear America wasn't playing small ball anymore. His foreign policy motto: speak softly and carry a big stick. And boy did he carry that stick. The US began asserting control in Latin America, under what would become known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. In plain English, Europe, stay out of our hemisphere, or else. And or else came with battleship. Quirky tidbit: when Roosevelt wanted to build the Panama Canal, and Colombia, which controlled Panama, refused to play ball, a mysterious revolution erupted in Panama. Within days, Panama declared independence and signed a deal with the US to build the canal. Coincidence? Historians remain suspicious. The canal was a triumph of engineering and a symbol of American willpower. But it was also a declaration. The US didn't just exist from sea to shining sea, it now connected seas. It had gone global in infrastructure, influence, and ambition. But here's the subtle twist. America still pretended this wasn't empire. Unlike the British or French, the US framed its interventions as protection, or liberation, or temporary stewardship. It was all very reluctant conqueror, but the results were the same: military bases, strategic islands, and economic control. And that contradiction, that the US was a republic born in anti-colonial revolt, but now managing colonies of its own, would define its foreign policy for the next century. It was a country that wanted to spread liberty, and also sometimes tell other countries exactly what to do. Historians still argue whether this era marked the true birth of American imperialism, or just a series of improvisations that snowballed. But either way, by the early 1900s, the United States was no longer a quiet power. It had muscle, reach, and a fast-growing navy that could show up just about anywhere with very little notice. And for the first time, European powers, Britain, France, Germany, started treating America not just as a curiosity, but as a rival, a young, cocky, well-funded rival with steamships, steel, and zero chill. The United States had stepped onto the world stage. It hadn't fully claimed center spotlight just yet, but the curtain was rising, and everyone could feel it. By the time the 20th century hit its teenage years, America had grown loud enough that nobody could ignore it, and rich enough that nobody wanted to. But it was still seen as the upstart, the muscle-bound new kid at the imperial table, full of energy, short on etiquette. Europe still ran the world, technically, but the US had that look, that future glow, and when World War I erupted, it would be America's first awkward test as a global power. The war started in 1914, not with America, but with an assassination in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it triggered a domino collapse of alliances and egos across Europe. Suddenly, The world's biggest empires were locked in an industrialized meat grinder. At first, the US stayed out. President Woodrow Wilson ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Americans agreed. This was a European mess, and the US had no appetite for trench-foot gas masks and the phrase "no man's land." But neutrality proved slippery. American banks loaned billions to the Allies. Factories cranked out weapons, boots, canned food, and uniforms, all for sale to the highest bidder, which conveniently was always Britain and France. And while the government said it was staying neutral, US industry was quietly choosing sides. Then came the Lusitania, a British passenger ship carrying civilians and some smuggled war supplies, was sunk by a German U-boat in 1915. Over 100 Americans died. Public outrage swelled. Germany promised to chill with the submarines for a while, but by 1917, Germany had had enough of chilled. They resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Then they made the mistake of sending the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message encouraging Mexico to invade the US if America joined the war. British intelligence intercepted it. America was not amused. Mainstream historical fact. On April 6, 1917, the US officially entered World War I. Not slowly, not tentatively. It jumped in with growing armies, deep pockets, and industrial might. Here's the quirky bit. America didn't really have a large army at the time. It had to draft, train, and ship over 2 million men in a hurry. They called it the American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John "Blackjack" Pershing. The troops arrived green and undertrained, but full of energy, new equipment, and frankly much better dental hygiene than their European counterparts. Their arrival wasn't just helpful, it was pivotal. Allied forces were exhausted after 3 years of bloody stalemates. The injection of fresh American troops helped tip the balance. Germany, battered and stretched thin, saw the writing on the wall. In November 1918, the war ended. Europe lay shattered. 4 empires collapsed: Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and German. And while European powers scrambled to bury the dead and redraw borders, America looked around and realized, wait, we made the difference. But then came the real plot twist. The US didn't stick around. President Wilson pushed hard for a post-war League of Nations, an international body to prevent future wars. It was idealistic, forward-thinking, and deeply unpopular in Congress. The Senate rejected it. The US never joined the League. And just like that, America stepped back from the global table it had just helped set. Historians still argue whether that decision cost the world a more peaceful century, or simply delayed the inevitable. Back home, the 1920s exploded into the roaring 20s. Flush with cash, the US went full Gatsby. Jazz, flappers, bootleggers, and skyscrapers. Ford's assembly lines made cars affordable. Wall Street boomed. Radios connected households coast to coast. The stock market became the national pastime, alongside baseball, which was incidentally also being exported as a global cultural symbol. And underneath it all, power. American banks were lending to Europe. American movies were filling foreign cinemas. American oil was fueling global growth. And American confidence. Off the chart, but there were cracks forming. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Spectacularly. The Great Depression wasn't just a recession, it was an economic black hole. Banks collapsed. Unemployment soared. Entire cities went broke. Soup lines replaced parades. And because the US economy had become central to the world, the crash ricocheted globally. Europe felt it. Latin America felt it. Asia felt it. The US, once a symbol of boundless growth, suddenly looked fragile. And yet, even in crisis, something was brewing beneath the misery. The government began experimenting. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal launched public works, social programs, and regulations. Bridges were built, roads paved. The economy reshaped. American democracy didn't collapse, it adapted. Slowly, clumsily, but it held. And this resilience sent a message to the world. America could take a punch. By the end of the 1930s, War was rumbling again in Europe. Fascism rose in Italy, Nazism in Germany, militarism in Japan. The world was moving toward a second, even more brutal war, and this time, America wouldn't be able to dip its toe in and walk away. The US was still reluctant, still tired. But the stage was set. Next time the curtain rose, America wouldn't just be a player, it would be the director. When World War II finally detonated in 1939, the United States didn't sprint onto the battlefield. It watched, it winced, it offered money, weapons, and the occasional stern letter. But even as Hitler marched across Europe and Japan carved through Asia, the American mood stayed isolationist. The wounds of World War I were still raw, and the Great Depression had barely scabbed over. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew war was coming. He could feel the gravity pulling the country toward it. But most Americans weren't ready to follow. Not yet. Then came December 7th. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was fast, shocking, and lethal. Over 2,400 Americans died. Battleships sank. Airfields were bombed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled in hours. For the first time since the War of 1812, America had been hit hard on its own soil. The next day, Congress declared war, not just on Japan, but soon after on Germany and Italy as well. The United States had officially entered World War II. And this time, it wasn't dipping a toe in, it cannonballed. Mainstream historical fact: between 1941 and 1945, the US became what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. American factories went from producing cars and toasters to tanks, bombers, bullets, and battleships. In 1 year alone, the US built nearly 100,000 aircraft. Think about that, planes, thousands of them, coming off assembly lines like they were Model Ts. Detroit turned into a war machine. Women, Rosie the Riveters, filled factory jobs. Children collected scrap metal. Ration books became normal. The country was all in. But this wasn't just about numbers. The US did something much bigger. It became the logistical backbone of the Allied war effort. Supplies, fuel, food, medicine, uniforms, boots, all flowed from American ports to global battlefields. Quirky detail: Coca-Cola was considered so vital to troop morale that bottling plants were built near the front lines. Soldiers could go without a bath, but not a Coke. Meanwhile, the US was fighting on two very different fronts. In Europe, it joined the British and Soviet forces to take down Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, it waged a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan, each battle more savage than the last. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And back home, something else was changing. The economy just a decade earlier on life support was booming. Unemployment vanished. Incomes rose. Women and minorities entered the workforce in record numbers. War was terrible, but for the American machine, it was a kind of adrenaline shot. Then, in 1945, the war ended, but not in the way anyone expected. The US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly killing over 100,000 people and shocking the world into surrender. Japan capitulated. The war was over. And just like that, the United States emerged as one of two superpowers, the other being the Soviet Union. Europe was in ruins. Asia was exhausted. The British Empire was collapsing. France had been humiliated. Germany was divided. But America stood tall, untouched by bomb craters, with factories humming, cities intact, and the bomb, the terrifying new symbol of ultimate power. Historians still argue whether the atomic bomb was dropped to end the war, or to send a warning to Stalin. Possibly both. And here's the kicker: the US didn't retreat after the war. It stayed. American troops remained in Europe and Japan. US dollars rebuilt Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, a massive aid package that wasn't just generous, it was strategic. A stable Europe meant a market for American goods, and a barrier against Soviet expansion. In Asia, the US occupied Japan and rebuilt it from scratch, rewriting its constitution, democratizing its institutions, and yes, installing vending machines and baseball. Not a joke. America also helped form the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. This wasn't just peacekeeping, it was empire building by invitation. The US had learned that influence didn't always require conquest. Sometimes, you just needed to fund the table, host the meeting, and pick the seating chart. Quirky but telling, the UN headquarters was placed in New York, not London, not Geneva, New York. Subtle power move. Back at home, the GI Bill sent veterans to college. Suburbs exploded. The middle class swelled. Highways were built. TVs flickered to life. The American dream wasn't just alive. It was mass-produced and heavily marketed. But under the surface, a new conflict was brewing. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, had its own ideas about the post-war world. It wanted security, buffer zones, ideological dominance. And it didn't like America's growing shadow one bit. And so the Cold War began. Not with a bang, but with a stare. The world was no longer a messy web of empires and colonies. It had become a chessboard with two superpowers moving pieces. One capitalist, one communist. The US and USSR would spend the next 40 years locked in competition. Not always openly, not always fairly, but always intensely. So by 1945, America hadn't just won a war, it had remade the world and placed itself at the center of it. Picture it, two massive powers, arms folded, eyes locked across the globe. No shots fired, not directly, but the tension palpable. Welcome to the Cold War, the longest, weirdest, and most paranoia-soaked chess match in human history. And the United States, fresh from its victory lap in World War II, found itself cast as one half of the world's new bipolar order. On one side, the United States capitalist, democratic, with an asterisk, and loud. On the other, the Soviet Union communist, authoritarian, and just as determined. The goal wasn't just survival, it was dominance. Economically, politically, culturally, and eventually, galactically. The early years were tense but polite-ish. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe. Eastern Bloc countries were locked into Soviet orbit. Meanwhile, the US backed Western Europe and launched the Marshall Plan, pumping billions into reconstruction. Not just generosity, it was strategic insulation from communism. Hungry people make radical choices. Full stomachs? Not so much. Then came the nukes. Both sides had them, lots of them, and more every year. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD for short, became national policy. The idea was simple and terrifying. If either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would obliterate them in return. Everybody dies, so no one starts. Cozy, right? Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Berlin airlift in 1948 was the first big Cold War showdown. The Soviets blockaded West Berlin. In response, the US and its allies flew in supplies every day for nearly a year. Chocolate bars parachuted from planes. Propaganda gold, the Soviets blinked first. America, without firing a shot, scored its first Cold War win. Meanwhile, Washington was cementing alliances like they were adding friends on Facebook. The most important, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. An agreement that if one member was attacked, all would respond. It was like a super-powered friend group, and the Soviets hated it. But the US wasn't only working through treaties. It started projecting influence through something even more seductive: culture. Hollywood exploded. Films, TV shows, and music poured across borders. Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean. The American aesthetic was irresistible. In places where US tanks would have been unwelcome, a Coca-Cola and a rock and roll record could slip right in. Quirky detail: in 1959, the US and USSR held a kitchen debate inside a model American home at a Moscow expo. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev literally argued in front of a dishwasher about whose system was better. Not joking, a dishwasher became a Cold War weapon. But not all battles were symbolic. The Cold War got hot in Korea. In 1950, North Korea, Soviet-backed, invaded the South. The US, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened. China joined in. 3 years later, after brutal combat and staggering casualties, the war ended in a draw. Korea remained split. Technically, it still is. Historians still argue whether Korea was a victory, a loss, or just a warning that proxy wars would define the next few decades. At home, America was booming and unraveling. The 1950s brought prosperity, suburbia grew, the middle class swelled. Car culture, fast food and highways became the norm. But underneath the gloss, fear simmered. McCarthyism gripped the country. Politicians saw communists behind every bush, in every studio, under every bed. Careers were ruined, books were banned. Un-American became a weaponized term. And then came the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite. It beeped over American skies and triggered a national panic. If they could launch a satellite, maybe they could launch a bomb. The US scrambled, NASA was born. Math textbooks were rewritten. Suddenly, being a nerd wasn't just cool, it was patriotic. In 1961, JFK took office. Young, telegenic, ambitious, he promised a new frontier, but instead, he got the Bay of Pigs, a failed CIA-led invasion of Cuba. Embarrassing. Cuba, under Fidel Castro, drifted firmly into the Soviet camp. Then things got nuclear. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the closest the world ever came to actual Armageddon. The Soviets installed nukes in Cuba, just 90 miles off Florida. The US freaked out. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade. Soviet ships approached. Tensions skyrocketed. And then, deal. The Soviets removed their missiles. The US secretly agreed to pull missiles out of Turkey. The world exhaled. Kennedy was praised. Khrushchev lost face. And from that moment on, every leader understood the Cold War could get very real, very fast. Quirky fact. After the missile crisis, the US and USSR installed the first red telephone hotline between Washington and Moscow. Not an actual red phone, but a secure connection, because next time, nobody wanted to wait on hold while deciding whether or not to end civilization. Through it all, the American economy kept expanding. Defense spending was enormous. Innovation was booming. The US became a technological giant. And with every rocket launch, television broadcast, and McDonald's franchise, it exported not just goods, but identity. The United States had become more than a country. It was now a global system. Economies were tied to the dollar, cultures were adapting to its entertainment. Alliances depended on its protection, and in every part of the world, nations quietly asked the same question. What's Washington going to do? For better or worse, America had become the planet's pivot. By the mid-1960s, America had hit peak Cold War confidence and was about to trip face first into one of its most complicated, controversial, and gut-checking conflicts, Vietnam. What began as a whisper of involvement spiraled into a full-scale war that would test not just American power, but the very idea of American righteousness. Let's rewind a bit. Vietnam, a small Southeast Asian country, had long been under foreign influence, first the French, then the Japanese during World War II, and then the French again. After the war, local communists under Ho Chi Minh declared independence, but France didn't want to let go. Fighting broke out. The USSR, fearing the spread of communism, began supporting the French with weapons and cash. By 1954, France was defeated at Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was temporarily split into North Communist and South Non-Communist, with an agreement to hold elections later. Spoiler, those elections never happened. Instead, the US stepped in first as advisors, then with special forces, and finally, boots on the ground. By the late 60s, over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. Officially, the mission was to stop the domino effect, the theory that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow like a tragic board game. Mainstream historical fact. The US never officially declared war on Vietnam. It just escalated. Slowly, relentlessly, like boiling a frog. But this wasn't like previous wars. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. The terrain was dense jungle. Traps were everywhere. Ambushes came out of nowhere. And the more firepower America unleashed, the more it seemed to push the Vietnamese deeper into resistance. And then came television. Vietnam was the first war broadcast directly into American living rooms. Families watched napalm strikes and body bags during dinner. Public support, once automatic, began to crack. especially when reports revealed the government had been painting a far rosier picture than the truth on the ground. Cue the Tet Offensive in 1968, a massive, coordinated surprise attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces across South Vietnam. Militarily, the US pushed back successfully, but psychologically, it was devastating. It proved the enemy was far from broken. Confidence collapsed, protests at home erupted. Quirky detail? At one point, a young folk singer named Country Joe McDonald sang the infamous "I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die" rag at Woodstock. The chorus, cheerfully sarcastic about sending kids to die, became an anthem for a generation that wasn't buying the government's story anymore. And it wasn't just students. Soldiers protested. Veterans spoke out. African American leaders highlighted the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied basic rights at home. Even politicians, once hawkish, started stepping away from the microphone. Historians still argue whether America could have won Vietnam, whatever that even means. But by the early 70s, public trust was shattered. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed decades of deception. The government had known for years that victory was unlikely. Then came Watergate. President Nixon, who had campaigned on ending the war with honor, found himself mired in scandal. A break-in, a cover-up, secret tapes. It all spiraled. In 1974, Nixon resigned, the only US president ever to do so. The war, still grinding on, became political kryptonite. Finally, in 1975, Saigon fell. North Vietnamese tanks rolled in. The US Embassy evacuated its staff from rooftops. South Vietnam ceased to exist. The Vietnam War cost the US over 58,000 lives. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers died. The country was torn, its credibility bruised, and its moral compass thrown into a tailspin. But something strange happened in the aftermath. America didn't retreat from the world. You'd think a trauma like Vietnam would trigger a foreign policy timeout. But no, the Cold War was still hot elsewhere. The Soviet Union hadn't gone anywhere. And so America regrouped, shaken, yes, but still massive, still armed, still central. And culturally, the 70s became a strange reflection of national mood. Cynicism seeped into movies. Think Taxi Driver, The Deer Hunter. Trust in institutions cratered. But beneath the disillusionment, there was a quiet resilience. America had been burned, but not broken. At the same time, new tools were emerging. Satellites, supercomputers, microchips. Silicon Valley was in its infancy. While Washington stumbled, innovation tiptoed forward. Meanwhile, the Middle East was beginning to take center stage. Oil shocks, embargoes, hostage crises. Another chapter in US global entanglement was brewing, but that's for later. For now, it's enough to say this. Vietnam was not the end of American power. It was the end of American innocence. No longer could the US pretend its power was always noble, its goals always clear, its victories always pure. The world had changed. And America, for better or worse, was still right in the middle of it. The 1980s didn't begin quietly. The US had just stumbled through a decade of war, scandal, inflation, gas lines, and disco. The vibes were off. Confidence was shaky. Enemies, real and imagined, seemed to be gaining ground. Then Ronald Reagan showed up on stage, like a cowboy stepping into a dusty saloon, and said, essentially, let's reboot the whole thing. And America listened. Reagan, former actor and governor of California, didn't just bring policy, he brought a narrative. One where the United States was still the shining city on a hill, where government was the problem, not the solution, and where the Cold War wasn't a complicated geopolitical struggle, but a face-off between good and evil. So what did this reboot look like? Start with the economy. Reagan's team cut taxes, especially for the wealthy and corporations. The theory was trickle-down economics. If you help businesses grow, prosperity will eventually reach everyone. Historians still argue whether that worked or if it just made the rich richer and hoped no one noticed. Meanwhile, the government also spent a ton of money on the military. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1980s, the US was spending over $300 billion annually on defense. The Navy expanded. Missiles were modernized. The Air Force got sleeker toys. and Reagan introduced his most infamous idea, Star Wars. No, not that Star Wars. The Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, was a proposed space-based missile defense system. Lasers, satellites, orbiting interceptors. It sounded like science fiction, because it kind of was. But the Soviets took it seriously, and that was the point. Even if it never fully worked, it was psychological warfare at orbital altitude. At the same time, America was fighting proxy battles everywhere. Central America, the Middle East, Africa. Anywhere the Soviets seemed to be poking around, the US would counter. The most infamous example, Iran-Contra. Short version, the US secretly sold weapons to Iran. Yes, the same Iran chanting death to America, and used the profits to fund anti-communist rebels, Contras in Nicaragua. All of this violated direct congressional bans. When it came out, it was a full-blown scandal, complete with shadowy meetings, shredded documents, and a lot of people suddenly forgetting things under oath. But Reagan remained oddly untouchable. Whether it was charisma, nostalgia, or exhaustion, much of the public let it slide. Here's your quirky moment. During a hot mic test in 1984, Reagan joked that the bombing of Russia would begin in 5 minutes. The Soviets didn't laugh. US forces briefly went on high alert. Oop. Now let's pivot to the real game changer of the decade. Technology. Silicon Valley was morphing from garages into glass towers. Apple launched its first Macintosh in 1984. Microsoft released Windows. IBM, Intel, and countless startups began wiring the future. The personal computer became not just a tool, but a symbol. America wasn't just out building. It was out coding. The information age had begun. And culturally, America was absolutely everywhere. Blockbusters like E.T., Top Gun, and Back to the Future dominated global box offices. MTV turned music into global fashion. American brands, Nike, Pepsi, Levi's, spread like gospel. You could be a kid in Bulgaria wearing a Michael Jackson shirt, drinking a Coke, and dreaming of California without ever leaving your block. The Cold War, meanwhile, was reaching its strange final phase. The Soviet Union, stretched thin by Afghanistan, its own Vietnam, economic stagnation, and growing dissent, began to wobble. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, a younger, reform-minded Soviet leader. He introduced 2 major policies: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These weren't just buzzwords, they were survival tactics. Gorbachev knew the USSR couldn't keep pace militarily or economically. He started loosening the grip, letting ideas in, allowing some private business, and in doing so, he cracked the shell. Then Reagan and Gorbachev started talking. Their meetings, at first chilly, grew warmer. In 1987, they signed the IMF treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles that hadn't happened before. For the first time, the arms race reversed. Historians still debate whether Reagan's build-up forced the Soviets to negotiate or whether Gorbachev would have done it anyway, because the system was already sinking. But either way, the temperature dropped. And then, in 1989, came the moment that symbolized everything. The Berlin Wall fell. Crowds with hammers. Soldiers standing down. Families reunited. The world watched East and West Berlin come together in one of the most surreal, joyful moments of the century. The Cold War wasn't officially over, but the world had changed. By 1990, communism was collapsing across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union itself teetered, and America, almost accidentally, was being handed the trophy. No parade, no final battle, just a new status, the world's last superpower. Quirky detail: McDonald's opened its first restaurant in Moscow in 1990. Thousands stood in line for hours. Not for the food, but for what it represented. Capitalism, culture, connection. America had won, not just with weapons, but with waffle fries. And so, as the decade closed, the US stood at the height of its power, military unmatched, economy booming, culture omnipresent, and a giant question looming: what happens when you're the only empire left? The 1990s dawned like the morning after a massive party, glitter still in the carpet, confetti in the plants, and the host, America standing there thinking, wait, did we just win the Cold War? Yes. Yes, it did. But what happens when you're the last empire standing? That was the question nobody had a script for. The Soviet Union, once a towering rival, officially dissolved in 1991. It didn't explode. It unraveled, quietly, awkwardly, with barely a whimper. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. Boris Yeltsin waved from a tank, and a massive chunk of the world map quietly redrew itself. And just like that, the United States wasn't one power among two, it was the only one left. The hegemon, a word that basically means the big kid nobody can ignore. Mainstream historical fact. By the early 1990s, the US accounted for about 25% of global GDP, had military bases in over 70 countries, and controlled a navy that could project force into any ocean on Earth. The dollar was the default currency for international trade. The internet, then a weird government tech project, was about to go public, and it was American. So what did the US do with this overwhelming advantage? Well, first it threw a war, the Gulf War, 1991. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. The world freaked out. Oil, allies, and geopolitical balance were all at risk. But this time, the US didn't go it alone. It built a coalition of over 30 nations, got United Nations approval, and launched Operation Desert Storm. It was fast, precise, televised. CNN became a global network broadcasting green-tinted footage of guided missile strikes. America flexed not just military power, but media dominance. It was war a spectacle, and the world watched in awe. Saddam's army was pushed out of Kuwait in weeks. The US decided not to go all the way to Baghdad. That decision would echo later, but at the time it felt like a clean win. Quick, low casualties, huge statement. And the message? The post-Cold War order wasn't going to be multipolar. It was going to be American-led. Next, the economy. The 1990s saw explosive growth. Computers entered homes, dial-up screeched, Silicon Valley ballooned. The dot-com boom turned nerds into billionaires. Bill Clinton took office in 1993, and by the end of the decade, the federal budget had a surplus. Yes, a surplus, for the first time in ages. Culturally, the US was omnipresent. Hollywood dominated. American sitcoms aired everywhere, from São Paulo to Singapore. McDonald's opened in Beijing. Nike became a religion. Michael Jordan was a global demigod. And the web, it changed everything. Quirky fact. In 1994, Jeff Bezos launched Amazon from a garage. In 1998, 2 Stanford students founded Google. That same year, LOL entered popular usage. The world was going digital, and America was coding the future. But for all its glow, the 1990s were not without shadows. Somalia, 1993. A US humanitarian mission turned combat disaster. Black Hawk helicopters were shot down in Mogadishu. Bodies of American soldiers were dragged through the streets. It was a brutal reminder, even in a unipolar world, America wasn't invincible. Rwanda, 1994. A genocide unfolded, while the world hesitated. Nearly 1 million people killed in just 100 days. The US, still rattled by Somalia, chose not to intervene. The silence spoke volume. Then came Yugoslavia. The Balkans imploded into ethnic warfare. Europe froze. The US eventually stepped in. Airstrikes, peacekeepers, NATO muscle. It worked, sort of. But again, the message was clear. If something truly needed doing, America had to do it. This wasn't empire by conquest. It was empire by default. Historians still argue whether America became a true empire during this time, or simply the world's emergency plumber, called in when the pipes burst and no one else could hold the wrench. Meanwhile, free trade became the mantra. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, linked the US, Canada, and Mexico. The World Trade Organization gained momentum. Globalization soared. American corporations spread everywhere. Borders blurred for business, but not for people. And at home, things felt chill. The Cold War was over. The economy was humming. Technology felt magical. People watched Friends, not the news. Even politics, while bitter, hadn't yet mutated into bloodsport. It was weirdly peaceful. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Terror groups like Al-Qaeda were growing in the Middle East, angry at US military presence, cultural influence, and support for regimes they saw as corrupt. In 1998, US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed. In 2000, the USS Cole was attacked in Yemen. The signals were there. But many Americans weren't looking. After all, history was over, right? A best-selling book even said so. The End of History and the Last Man, by Francis Fukuyama. His thesis: liberal democracy and free markets had won, and the future would just be minor tweaks to a system already in place. Spoiler: it did not age well, because just around the corner, a single morning in September would reset everything. But in the closing moments of the 90s, America was still glowing with victory, wealth, and a sense of invincibility. The Cold War had ended, the future was wired, and the United States wasn't just ruling the world, it was designing it. It started like any other Tuesday. September 11th, 2001. Blue skies over Manhattan. Morning commuters, coffee in hand, flights landing and departing. The routine hum of a global superpower going about its business. And then, 8:46 a.m., a sudden violent rupture in the narrative of American invincibility. A plane, a second, the Pentagon, then a crash in a Pennsylvania field. By mid-morning, the United States was no longer asking if it was under attack. It was wondering how it could have ever felt untouchable in the first place. Nearly 3,000 people dead. Civilians, first responders, passengers. The Twin Towers, gone. The Pentagon scorched. Smoke, chaos, disbelief. A new phrase entered the national vocabulary. Mainstream historical fact. This was the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history. Not just in scale, but in symbolism. The World Trade Center wasn't just a building, it was a global icon of commerce. The Pentagon was military command central. These weren't just targets, they were messages. The group responsible, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, a Saudi-born extremist hiding in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban. And the US response was swift, overwhelming, and historic. By October, the US invaded Afghanistan. It wasn't just retaliation, it was a mission to dismantle Al-Qaeda, to remove the Taliban, and to remake Afghanistan into something more stable, more democratic. And for a while, it seemed to work. The regime fell quickly, training camps were bombed, bin Laden vanished. But American forces stayed. Meanwhile, a deeper transformation was taking place at home. The Department of Homeland Security was created, the Patriot Act passed, controversially giving government agencies sweeping surveillance powers. Airports became fortresses. Fear became policy, and the phrase national security became a kind of magic key that unlocked almost any new law. And then, Iraq. The US government, led by President George W. Bush, began warning that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. The message was clear: if 9/11 happened once, it could happen again, unless America went on the offensive. The invasion began in 2003. Shock and awe. Bombing raids lit up Baghdad. Saddam's regime collapsed fast. Statues toppled. American troops rolled in. Another mission: regime change, disarmament, democracy. Only, there were no WMDs. The intelligence was flawed, or manipulated, depending on who you ask. And while Saddam was captured, Iraq didn't become a beacon of stability. It fractured. Militias, insurgents, terrorists filled the vacuum. What was supposed to be a lightning war became a long, bloody occupation. Historians still argue whether Iraq was a strategic blunder or an ideological crusade, or both. Quirky detail. In 2003, President Bush gave a speech under a banner that read, "Mission accomplished." It became an instant meme, a haunting symbol of how quickly optimism can curdle. Back in Afghanistan, the Taliban was regrouping, slowly, quietly. But the US had now committed to 2 wars, both open-ended, both expensive, both complex. And while troops were fighting overseas, Americans at home were being asked to yes. In one infamous post-9/11 press conference, Bush told the public to go shopping to show terrorists they hadn't won. It was a surreal blend of wartime mobilization and business-as-usual consumerism. Meanwhile, the economy soared until it didn't. The 2008 financial crisis was a gut punch, caused by reckless lending, deregulation, and over-offense. It began in the housing market and quickly devoured global finance. Banks collapsed, unemployment spiked, millions lost homes, jobs, savings. The federal government stepped in with massive bailouts. Wall Street recovered. Main Street, not so fast. And here's the bitter twist. While bankers got bonuses, many Americans got foreclosures. Distrust deepened. Resentment grew. The system, it seemed, worked, but only for the people who had built it. Yet amid the wreckage, something else happened. A campaign that felt like a movement. Barack Obama, a first-term senator, ran on hope and change, and won. In 2008, he became the first black president in US history. It was a global event. People danced in the streets of Chicago, cried in Nairobi, cheered in Berlin. America, despite everything, still had the power to surprise the world. Obama inherited 2 wars and a crumbling economy. He ended combat operations in Iraq. He ordered the operation that found and killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. And slowly, the war on terror began to shift. From invasions to drones, from armies to intelligence networks. But if the 2000s were about war and fear, the 2010s were about identity. The Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Tea Party protests, WikiLeaks, Snowden. A new generation, raised on the internet, was watching everything and questioning all of it. And globally, the US was still dominant, but not alone. China was rising fast. Economically, militarily, technologically, Russia was reasserting itself. Europe was drifting. The unipolar moment was ending. Quietly. Quirky tech fact. By 2010, more people had mobile phones than toilets, and the companies shaping the digital age, Google, Facebook, Apple, were American. Power was no longer just in Washington or the Pentagon. It was in the cloud, on your phone, in algorithms. The battlefield had expanded, and so had the definition of influence. America still ruled the world, but now it was juggling the fallout of its choices, the disruption of its own inventions, and the unsettling realization that the future might not always come with instructions. By the 2010s, the United States had evolved into something stranger than an empire, an operating system. Not just a country with power, but a framework the world was increasingly built on. Currency, dollar. Internet protocols, mostly American designed. Entertainment, still overwhelmingly Hollywood. Social media. Welcome to platforms owned by Silicon Valley, headquartered in places where the climate is mild, but the data is absolute. And while the military might remain, it wasn't always the most important tool in the kit anymore. Influence had gotten softer, smarter, even suppler, sometimes, but not always cleaner. Let's start with technology. Mainstream historical fact. By 2015, 5 of the 10 biggest companies in the world, by market value, were American tech firms. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Alphabet, Amazon, and Facebook. These weren't just businesses, they were ecosystems. Economies ran through them. Elections were shaped by them, revolutions too. And these tech giants weren't bound by borders. They set community standards that applied from Nebraska to Nairobi. They hosted more conversations than most countries. And quietly, they held more data than any government on Earth. That's real power. But it came without the old costumes. No medals, no flags, no national anthems. Just terms of service no one reads and buttons that say accept all cookies. Culturally, America was still everywhere. Game of Thrones wasn't American technically, but HBO was. Netflix became global. Beyoncé concerts sold out in dozens of countries. Fast food chains planted flags in places the US military never had. Quirky stat. By the late 2010s, there were more KFCs in China than in the US. Colonel Sanders had conquered more terrain than some actual colonels. Politically though, things were fracturing. Partisan divisions sharpened. Social media threw gas on every disagreement. Truth itself started to feel negotiable. News became tribal. Facts went to war with feelings. A growing number of Americans, and observers worldwide, began asking, if the U.S. runs the world, but can't trust its own reflection, what exactly is it exporting? Then came Donald Trump's election wasn't just a political upset, it was a cultural earthquake. The most powerful job on earth, handed to a real estate mogul turned reality TV star with no government experience. Supporters called it a victory for forgotten voices. Critics called it a crisis for democracy. The rest of the world blinked, and then recalculated. Trump's foreign policy was not subtle. Alliances questioned, trade wars launched, climate agreements exited. He tore up deals, hugged dictators, praised strongmen, and tweeted military threats in all caps. It was hard to predict, harder to explain, and nearly impossible to ignore. One thing was clear, the US was rebranding again, loudly. America first, global order, optional. Historians still argue whether Trump's presidency was an aberration or a revelation of deeper truths that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Meanwhile, China kept rising. Economically, technologically, militarily, the Belt and Road Initiative expanded its global footprint. Cities like Shenzhen went from fishing towns to tech megacities in a single generation. TikTok, yes, that TikTok, was the first major social media platform not born in the US, and it exploded into Western culture like a Trojan horse full of memes. In response, the US began talking more openly about great power competition. The Cold War language crept back, now aimed east instead of at Moscow. Cybersecurity, rare earth metals, 5G networks. It wasn't about tanks anymore, it was about supply chains. And yet, militarily, America was still king. The US Navy patrolled every ocean. Its drone program, launched in the early 2000s, had become a near-invisible form of warfare. Targeted strikes, surgical hits, collateral debates. The war on terror didn't end, it just quieted. Less boots, more bots. Quirky and unsettling fact. By 2019, the US had more drone pilots than traditional fighter pilots. And on the home front, tension. The economy kept growing, but inequality ballooned. Cities gentrified, rural areas hollowed. Tech millionaires built bunkers. People started Googling how to move to Canada every election year. Wildfires, hurricanes, mass shootings, school lockdown drills, a country running hot on all frequencies. But the dollar stayed strong. The movies kept winning. The tech kept scaling. The military never flinched. And so the machine kept moving. But then came the next rupture, one that didn't involve bombs or ballots. A virus. Late 2019. Early warnings from China. By March 2020, the world slammed shut. COVID-19 swept across the globe and exposed everything. The strengths, the weaknesses, the illusions. The US, for all its wealth and innovation, stumbled hard. Supply chains broke. Hospitals overflowed. Leaders contradicted themselves. Death tolls climbed. The most powerful nation on earth looked stuck. Yet, vaccines came fast, American-made. Distribution rolled out, and slowly, the country adapted, if not always gracefully. The pandemic didn't end American leadership, but it questioned the brand. If America could go viral for all the wrong reasons, what did that mean for its claim to global stewardship? The answer was already forming, in code. Crypto, AI, virtual reality, deepfakes. The next frontier wasn't a continent, it wasn't even physical, it was digital, and it was being built, again, largely by the United States. Not just a country anymore, but a blueprint for the 21st century. Messy, glitchy, charismatic, dangerous, dazzling, still powerful, still polarizing, still the player, but now finally with competition on the horizon, and cracks forming in the glass. As the 2020s rolled in with the subtlety of a freight train made of fireworks, the United States found itself in a surreal position. It was still the most powerful country on earth, but no longer unquestionably so. The world it had shaped was starting to shape it back, and for the first time in generations, people began asking a question out loud. Is American dominance actually permanent? Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The facts were still staggering. The US remained the world's largest economy or second largest, depending on how you do the math. China was getting close. It controlled the most influential tech platforms. It had the largest and most expensive military by orders of magnitude. It was still the headquarters of the global financial system. The dollar remained the reserve currency, and American culture, still exporting like hotcakes. But something had changed, or maybe fractured. Start with politics. After the chaos of the Trump years, and a pandemic to boot, Americans elected Joe Biden in 2020 with a simple request: please stabilize the country. His presidency arrived like a warm, bland compress over a national bruise. No late-night tweet storms, no reality show drama, just a lot of infrastructure talk and attempts at decency. But unity, that didn't happen. Mainstream historical fact. By the early 2020s, American political polarization had reached levels not seen since the 19th century. Entire states felt like ideological islands. Friends stopped talking over yard signs. Even the idea of truth, once assumed to be a shared baseline, became a hot-button issue. And here's the thing: the world was watching. Allies wondered whether America could be counted on. Adversaries wondered how far they could push. Suddenly, global influence wasn't just about aircraft carriers. It was about credibility. Now layer in technology. AI exploded. Chatbots passed bar exams. Algorithms could create fake images, fake videos, fake people, and while the US was still ahead just barely, the race was no longer solo. China had its own AI arms, its own quantum labs, its own digital firepower. America still had the edge in raw innovation, but the gap was closing. Fast. Quirky fact: in 2023, an AI-generated song that mimicked two famous rappers went viral before being pulled down. It sounded real. And for many, it marked the moment the internet fully entered its uncanny phase. Meanwhile, global power wasn't just shifting, it was multiplying. India's population surpassed China's. Europe leaned further into tech regulation and climate policy. Brazil, Indonesia, and Nigeria were gaining influence. It wasn't that America was falling, it's that the rest of the world was rising. And yet, America's gravity still held. TikTok might be Chinese-owned, but it was American-style influence on full blast. Global diplomacy still needed Washington. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it was US weapons, US money, and US-led coalitions that helped turn the tide. The old playbook: build alliances, fund defense, lead press conferences wasn't dead. It just needed rebooting. But for every diplomatic win, there was a domestic question mark. Gun violence, climate disasters, rising authoritarian flirtations in red state politics, drug overdoses, homelessness, a Supreme Court that looked increasingly like a political battlefield. The phrase American decline trended regularly, and not just in op-eds. TikTok teens were quoting Gibbon. Historians still argue whether this is actual decline or just recalibration. Because America wasn't retreating, it was evolving. You could feel it in new spaces. Space itself. For example, NASA was back in the game with Artemis missions to the moon. Private companies, SpaceX, Blue Origin, were treating orbit like a playground. Mars was on the mood board. America wasn't just aiming to stay ahead on Earth, it was setting up to lead beyond it. And in the digital world, it still controlled the roads. Facebook, despite its scandals, had billions of users. Amazon controlled global logistics. Google was the internet's front door. And Apple turned personal tech into a kind of religion. Quirky cultural pulse check. In 2024, an American rapper performed a holographic concert simultaneously on 5 continents, while also selling digital sneakers in the metaverse. And yet, under all of this power, a very American contradiction pulsed louder than ever. Are we the good guys? It wasn't rhetorical. Gen Z asked it outright. So did people abroad. US history, the parts schools skipped. was resurfacing on social media in real time. Colonialism, indigenous genocide, slavery, the Cold War's shady ops, the myth of pure intention was getting dismantled. But here's the pivot. This self-questioning was also a form of strength. Other empires in history rarely reflected. They conquered, decayed, vanished. The US itself kept arguing with itself, protesting, publishing, voting, whistleblowing, creating art about its flaws and then winning Oscars for it. In a weird way, that chaos was also a sign of resilience. The rest of the world, even while criticizing, kept copying. American startups, American slang, American storytelling, even anti-American sentiment, often came wrapped in American memes. So where was this all heading? Some said we were entering a post-American world, a decentralized order where no one country dominates. Others said the US was just resetting for the next phase: cleaner energy, smarter tech, better medicine, less empire, but more blueprint. Because while America might no longer rule the world in the old-fashioned red, white, and blue way, it had become something weirder, more lasting. A platform, still messy, still noisy, still under construction, but still undeniably central. So here we are, perched at the edge of the present, with America still spinning its many plates: power, culture, chaos, charm. If we've learned anything over the last couple hundred years, it's that America doesn't operate by blueprint. It stumbles forward, usually with too much confidence, occasionally with clarity, and often with a snack in hand. Now let's talk about what it all adds up to: the legacy, the method, and the weird genius of how America didn't just gain power, but shaped what power looks like. Because while other empires conquered with flags and forts, America did something more elusive. It made the world want its stuff. Not just goods, but dreams. That's the twist. The United States didn't just export cars. It exported freedom as a convertible. It didn't just sell jeans. It sold rebellion, sex appeal, and Friday night under the lights. Call it soft power, call it cultural dominance, call it manipulation through pop songs, whatever you call it, it worked. Mainstream historical fact: after World War II, the US used programs like the Marshall Plan, not only to rebuild Europe, but to flood it with American products, values, and habits. The dollar didn't just rebuild cities, it rewired them. By the late 20th century, you couldn't walk through a mall in Jakarta or a square in Paris without bumping into some version of American life. A Subway sandwich here, a Hollywood poster there, the whole world started speaking fluent America, even if it didn't always agree with it. But here's what's even stranger: while exporting culture, America also absorbed it. From jazz to tacos, kung fu to K-pop, it didn't just push out influence, it sucked it in, remixed it, and beamed it back with subtitles and Spotify playlists. That flexibility, that cultural elasticity, has become one of America's sneakiest weapons. Empires rot when they become rigid. But the US, it mutates. Which brings us to the real fuel behind the machine: narrative. America tells stories better than almost anyone. Land of opportunity, the American dream, self-made, from rags to riches. These aren't just slogans, they're operating systems. People believe them, build businesses around them, risk their lives to chase them. Even if the reality doesn't always measure up, the dream travels. And in a world increasingly driven by attention, narrative is currency. Quirky fact: more people worldwide watched American movies in 2023 than voted in any single national election, anywhere. But let's not gloss over the contradictions. This isn't a fairy tale. The United States is still struggling loudly with inequality, violence, a changing climate, racial injustice, political paralysis, healthcare dysfunction, and enough mass shootings to numb the soul. It imprisons more people than any other country. It often fails to live up to the ideals it markets. Historians still argue whether America's power was built on democratic genius or economic opportunism, or both. Whether its freedom is foundational or just functional. Whether it rules by virtue or by inertia. But for all that, it keeps going. America reinvents itself constantly, from colonies to revolution, from civil war to industrial titan, From quiet farmer republic to global superpower. From Eisenhower highways to Elon Musk rockets. Even now, in a world with rising competitors, China, the EU, India, America still holds an edge. Not because it's perfect, but because it knows how to reset. It fails big, but it tries again, and that try again is sticky. It's in Silicon Valley's garages, in hip-hop studios, in dive bars turned campaign headquarters, in late-night pizza-fueled startups and protest marches down Main Street, in a constitution barely 4 pages long, yet stretched across centuries like philosophical duct tape. One of the strangest parts of American dominance is how accidental it sometimes feels. No grand plan, just a series of experiments, fueled by caffeine, conflict, and the occasional moon landing. And that experiment, it's contagious. When a country builds not just armies and banks, but the expectation of change, it makes the world look at its own systems and say, why not us? That's why, even if American military supremacy fades, and one day it will, its influence will linger. In ideas, in platforms, in language, in memes. It's already baked into the internet's DNA. That doesn't mean it'll always lead, or that it should. Other voices are rising. The world is finally balancing, slowly, and America, if it's wise, won't resist that. It'll adapt. Again, because its truest strength was never just its economy or its bombs. It was always its capacity to absorb chaos and make meaning out of it. And that might just be what keeps it in orbit, long after the flags are faded and the empires fall silent. Let's rewind, not to the start of the nation, but to the start of the people who made it tick in ways textbooks rarely highlight. Not the generals, or the presidents, or the robber barons. Tonight we zoom in on something less flashy, but maybe more defining. The everyday American, the soft machinery behind the superpower. Because for all its big moves, America wasn't built by marble statues and 5-star briefings. It was built by kids selling lemonade, by immigrants unpacking their first bags, by families building barbecue pits next to bomb shelters. The quiet part of America's rule. It wasn't just what it conquered, but how it taught people to believe they could conquer something, if not land, then life. Start with the classroom. From the very beginning, America treated education as more than a civic duty. It was a forge. School wasn't just about reading and math. It was where little Americans were made. Pledge of Allegiance every morning. Founding Father law by 3rd grade. Civics, elections, maps, with red, white, and blue borders. It wasn't subtle. You learned not just history, but how to interpret it. We're the good guys. Always. Maybe that was a stretch. Maybe it skipped a few chapters. But the storytelling was deliberate and effective. Mainstream historical fact. By the 20th century, the US had one of the highest literacy rates in the world, and one of the first systems of universal public schooling. That helped fuel its industrial growth, its innovation booms, and eventually its military complex. You can't build a moon rocket if nobody understands algebra. But education wasn't just about knowledge. It was about expectation. The myth of upward mobility, that any kid with enough grit could go from rags to CEO, was fed early and often, even when the math didn't always work out. Next came work ethic, that American grind, long hours, short vacations, and an allergy to idleness. Even our weekends were productivity themed. The US created entire genres of self-help devoted to hustle. Books like Think and Grow Rich, phrases like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which by the way started as a sarcastic joke about doing the impossible. Then Americans took it literally and wrote it into motivational posters. Quirky fact, by 2019, Americans were taking fewer vacation days than almost any developed country, and many felt guilty even doing that. Somewhere along the line, rest became suspicious. If you weren't grinding, were you even trying? Now mix in faith. Religion shaped the American psyche deeply, especially evangelical Christianity. Churches weren't just spiritual homes, they were voting blocks, community centers, disaster shelters, and yes, startup incubators. The prosperity gospel, pray hard, work hard, and God will reward you, dovetailed neatly with capitalism. But it wasn't just Christian. America became a patchwork of beliefs. Hindu temples in suburban strip malls, mosques in Midwest neighborhoods, Buddhist centers in converted old diners. Religion adapted to America's rhythm, and vice versa. Then, layer in family mythology. No matter when your ancestors arrived, your story probably started the same way. They came for a better life. Ellis Island, the Rio Grande, the Pacific docks. Maybe they were running, maybe they were chasing. Either way, they were sold a deal. If you sacrifice now, your kids will rise. That generational bargain became the soul of the middle class, and the middle class became the heart of America's dominance. Historians still argue whether the US ever truly had a stable middle class, or whether it was a post-World War II anomaly. But for several decades, from the 1950s through the 80s, it felt real. Home ownership, college, 2 cars, a dog, a pension. Not everyone got it, but enough people did that the idea took hold. And when America exported its influence, it didn't just send drones or denim, it sent this dream. Foreign policy was often about markets and oil, but underneath was a subtler message. You too could live like us. That was the real empire. The idea that freedom came with air conditioning and a 2-car garage. Even when the dream frayed, the myth held. Quirky moment. In 2009, after the housing crash, Americans bought more self-storage space than any other country. Even while losing homes, they clung to their stuff. A strange badge of survival. Now let's talk about youth. Young people in the US weren't just raised to take over America. They were raised to question it, from the counterculture of the 60s to climate marches in the 2020s. Rebellion became part of the brand. Protest wasn't un-American. It was peak American. That paradox, raising kids to salute the flag and challenge the system, is weirdly unique and powerful, because it means the country is always under construction, always being argued with, always being remixed, and that, perhaps, is the secret to America's strange, enduring grip on global power. Not just its laws or its wealth, but its habit of reinvention. When the world looked at the US, it didn't just see a superpower, it saw a story machine, where failure wasn't fatal, where comebacks were sacred, where tomorrow was always pending, but never out of reach. Even now, in a fractured digital world, that instinct persists. Kids still post vision boards. Immigrants still dream in English. Disillusioned voters still vote, even if just to scream through the ballot. So yes, America runs on weapons and markets and contracts and Wi-Fi, but also, it runs on belief. Messy, hypocritical, sometimes delusional, but belief that tomorrow could be different, better, fairer, and that you, yes, you could help make it that way. And that belief? That's harder to kill than any empire. By now, you're probably thinking, okay, America's powerful, messy, myth-driven, got it. But how exactly does a country go from battlefield startup to planetary landlord? The answer, as always, lives partly in the shadows. Tonight, we peek behind the curtain at how the US built the world's most complex, invisible empire. Not with flags, but with networks. We're talking about infrastructure, but not roads and bridges, more like money wires, fiber optic cables, banking protocols, and airspace permissions. America's dominance didn't just happen on battlefields, it happened in the plumbing of the planet. Let's start with money. The US dollar isn't just America's currency, it's the global fallback plan. Oil is priced in dollars. International loans are issued in dollars. When a crisis hits, even one caused by Wall Street, countries still rush to buy dollars. It's weird, it's kind of unfair, and it's absolutely intentional. Mainstream historical fact. In 1944, near the end of World War II, world leaders met at a place called Bretton Woods and decided the post-war financial system would run through the US dollar. It was pegged to gold. Other currencies pegged themselves to the dollar. When Nixon unpegged it from gold in the 1970s, nothing fell apart. The dollar just stayed king. Even now, decades later, most international reserves are held in dollars. Global trade often flows through SWIFT, a messaging system for banks. Guess who holds veto power in it? The United States. If the US doesn't like a regime, it doesn't always send troops. It can just freeze access to dollars, cut you off from SWIFT, sanction your central bank. That's financial warfare. Quiet, surgical, and sometimes more painful than bombs. Quirky detail. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and its allies froze over $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Not tanks, just code. And it worked. Then there's technology. The internet was born in the US. Sure, it's global now, but its core protocols, naming systems like .com and .org, and many of the underwater cables that carry traffic between continents, American companies helped build those. Some are still in control. Even when people say the internet should be neutral, what they often mean is, let's keep it working the way America set it up. And when companies like Google, Microsoft, or Amazon expand their cloud empires, they're not just providing service, they're setting rules for security, for data flow, for censorship. Some governments resist, others comply. But the underlying structure remains very red, white, and blue, even when it's in grayscale. Then we get to air and sea. The US Navy has been patrolling major shipping lanes for decades. Not as an act of aggression, but as a kind of global babysitter. Piracy down. Thank the Navy. Trade routes stable. Thank naval logistics. Aircraft carriers don't just launch planes, they stabilize commerce. Historians still argue whether America does this out of duty or self-interest. The answer, as usual, is both. A world that runs smoothly is good for US business. So why not play security guard? Meanwhile, America's intelligence infrastructure hums like a galaxy-sized machine. The NSA, CIA, DIA, AIA, NRO, each with different specialties. Signals, satellites, analysis, cyber tools. Edward Snowden's 2013 leak revealed just how vast the surveillance system is. Phones tapped, data mined, even allied leaders' calls monitored. Awkward, but also expected. The US gathers information not just to catch bad guys, but to shape futures. Political ones, economic ones, military ones. Quirky fact, at one point, the NSA was collecting metadata on every American phone call. Not content, just who called whom, when, and for how long. Think of it as surveillance light, with full calorie consequences. But let's pivot back to something less cloak and dagger. Logistics. The modern world runs on just-in-time delivery systems, raw materials, chips, parts. Everything moves fast until it doesn't. And when things break, like in 2020 during the pandemic, the fragility becomes obvious. Ships stack at ports, shelves empty, panic spreads. Guess who often steps in to unjam the system? US companies, US ships, US infrastructure, consultants. And when disasters strike, earthquakes, tsunamis, invasions, the US military isn't just the first with guns. It's often the first with clean water, bulldozers, and helicopters. This kind of non-military military power is a massive part of how America rules. It's empire without colonies, authority without occupation. It's what some scholars call network power, and it's sticky. Once a country starts depending on US systems, financial, technological, logistical, it's hard to unplug. Alternatives exist, but they're smaller, slower, or more fragile. That gives America a unique kind of influence. It doesn't have to say do this to get its way. It just has to say, do you want to keep using the system? And most say yes, please, thank you. Now, is that sustainable? Maybe, maybe not. New networks are rising. China's building its own payment systems, navigation satellites, and tech stacks. Europe's tightening data laws and exploring currency independence. Decentralized blockchain networks whisper of a post-nation future. But for now, the US remains the default setting of the modern world. It's the router password, and the tech support line. You might not love how it works, but if it goes offline, everything slows down. That's not just power, that's design-level dominance. So we've talked about empires of territory, empires of trade, and empires of code. But what about the kind of power that's hard to measure, where America's influence gets under your skin, Quite literally, welcome to the world of culture as control, where movies, music, fashion, and memes do what missiles can't. They make people want the American version of life. This is soft power at its most seductive, and sometimes its strangest. Let's start with the obvious: Hollywood. For a full century, American films have dominated global screens. From Casablanca to Avengers Endgame, Hollywood isn't just exporting entertainment, it's exporting a worldview. Individualism, justice, romance, underdogs, explosions. Even the apocalypse, when it shows up, happens in New York first. Mainstream historical fact: by the early 2000s, Hollywood accounted for more than 70% of global box office revenues. Not because other countries didn't have talent, they absolutely did, but the US had distribution networks, budget scale, and cultural reach. That meant more than just stars on screen. It meant ideas. American movies taught the world what prom was, what a quarterback looked like, what a courtroom sounded like. You could grow up in another country and still somehow know what spring break is. And it wasn't just movies. American music has shaped global soundtracks since the Jazz Age. Blues, rock, hip-hop, country, EDM genres born in America went global. Michael Jackson moonwalked across continents. Beyoncé is basically royalty in more than one hemisphere. And hip-hop, a cultural form once dismissed as underground noise, became a dominant global genre, now rapped in over 100 languages. Quirky fact: there's a thriving Japanese scene for cowboy cosplay in country western bars. They dress the part, sing the songs, and line dance like they grew up in Texas, many of them never having left Tokyo. Then there's fashion. From Levi's to Nike, from streetwear to high fashion. America made casual cool. A t-shirt, once an undergarment, is now a blank canvas for expression. Thanks largely to American style. Denim became global uniform, and dressing down became a power move. Think Steve Jobs in his turtleneck, or Zuckerberg in his hoodie. That look started in Silicon Valley and now runs half of global tech. But perhaps nothing spreads American culture faster or weirder than fast food. McDonald's, KFC, Starbucks. These aren't just restaurants, they're outposts. When McDonald's opened in Moscow in 1990, people waited in line for hours, not for the food, but for the idea. It was greasy, salty globalization, served with a straw. By the 2010s, McDonald's had more outlets abroad than in the US. Same with KFC. And the menus changed: teriyaki burgers in Japan, paneer wraps in India, McSpaghetti in the Philippines. It wasn't just export, it was cultural fusion. But American culture isn't just food and fun, it's also identity shaping. TV shows like Friends, Grey's Anatomy, Stranger Things, and even The Office became training manuals for speech, slang, relationships, and humor. American media taught the world to talk like it, argue like it, date like it. People began quoting sitcoms as if they were scripture. Historians still argue whether this cultural spread has been mostly organic or strategic. But the result is clear. America became the narrative engine for the planet. Even when the stories critique America, slavery, war, injustice, they're still American stories. That's the power of cultural self-awareness. The US can both mythologize and roast itself, and still dominate the airwaves. Now cue the internet. America invented it, populated it, and initially owned the tone. YouTube, Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, all born in the US, all global now. Memes, once inside jokes, became international diplomacy. A photo of Bernie Sanders sitting cross-legged in mittens, viral in 40 languages. A TikTok dance made by a teenager in Atlanta, copied by millions in Mumbai. Quirky moment. In 2020, the phrase "OK Boomer," coined on American internet forums, was used in New Zealand's parliament by a 25-year-old lawmaker during a debate. That's cultural drift in action. But here's the twist. As America shaped global culture, it also became the battleground for cultural backlash. Anti-American protests sometimes happened with protesters wearing Levi's and holding iPhones. The contradiction is baked in. And now, countries are pushing back, sometimes by regulation. See Europe's crackdowns on big tech, sometimes with countercultures of their own. K-pop, Bollywood, Nollywood, and Turkish dramas are building alternative entertainment empires. Chinese apps are dominating screen time. The cultural monopoly is fraying, but not collapsing. Because American culture isn't just a product, it's a rhythm, a habit, a filter. Even people who say they hate it often still move to it. That's deeper than influence. That's operating system territory. It's not all good, of course. The export of American ideals sometimes ignores context. Freedom of speech in theory becomes misinformation in practice. Empowerment campaigns in one culture clash violently in another. And the assumption that American values are universal has caused more than a few wars, literal and ideological. But again, the strange resilience shows. America isn't just forcing culture down the world's throat. The world is responding, remixing, clapping back, collabing. The global culture war is also a collab album, whether we admit it or not. In the end, America's most subtle form of power may be this. It doesn't just invade your country, it moves into your head. By this point in the story, America isn't just on the world stage. It built the stage, sold the tickets, and runs concessions during intermission. But every empire, even the informal ones, has a home base, and tonight, we step back from the global drama to walk through the attic of US power, Washington, D.C. The city itself wasn't supposed to be this important, designed to be neutral, aloof, above the fray, neither northern nor southern, nor the rich port, nor industrial hub. But over time, Washington morphed from a sleepy capital into the nerve center of the modern world. Not because of its skyline, there isn't one, thanks to height restrictions, but because of the conversations that happen behind closed doors. Let's talk about how it works. At first glance, the US government seems simple. Congress writes laws. The president executes them. The Supreme Court interprets them. That's the pamphlet version. But behind the scenes, it's way messier. Layers of staffers, agencies, advisors, think tanks, donors, lobbyists, intelligence briefings, and handshake deals happening over charred salmon in quiet Georgetown restaurants. That's where the real machinery lives. Mainstream historical fact. The federal government employs over 2 million civilians, not counting military personnel. That's more than the population of several US states. Add contractors, consultants, and non-profits that orbit Capitol Hill, and you've got a full-blown influence ecosystem. Want to know how America rules the world? Start with the committee hearing. Boring? Yes. But from those panels come budgets that fund drone fleets, vaccine pipelines, clean energy subsidies, or satellite launches. And most of those hearings? Live streamed, open to the public, and largely ignored. Quirky fact, the Pentagon has twice as many bathrooms as necessary. A holdover from segregation laws during its construction in the 1940s. Even in the heart of US power, the past leaves fingerprint. Then there's the White House, symbolic epicenter, global photo op factory, and actual workplace. When the president speaks, markets tremble. When they tweet, depending on the president, alliances sweat. And while the position has constitutional limits, let's be honest, few people on Earth have more de facto power than whoever sits behind that historic desk in the Oval Office. But presidents don't rule alone. Enter the alphabet soup of agencies: CIA, NSA, FBI, DOE, DHS, USAID, each with its own domain, budget, culture, and secrets. Some protect, some spy, some build, some negotiate. Together, they form what some scholars call the deep state. Not in the conspiracy theory sense, but as a term for the permanent government, the civil service machine that keeps going regardless of who wins elections. Think of it as the autopilot system of the empire, quiet, often invisible, and absolutely essential. Now throw in lobbyists. America doesn't just export democracy, it imports influence. Every industry, oil, pharma, defense, big tech, spends millions annually to shape laws, slow regulations, or sneak in tax breaks. The result? Legislation gets complex, votes get messy, and the public often loses track of who's steering what. Historians still argue whether this system counts as functional democracy or corporatized gridlock. But either way, it works. Slowly, unevenly, but it works. And while DC runs on policy and power, it also runs on ritual. State of the Union addresses, Senate confirmations, Supreme Court hearings. These moments, televised and choreographed, keep the system feeling tangible. They're America's national theatre, where ideals are reaffirmed even when nobody fully agrees on what they mean anymore. Quirky tradition. During inaugurations, the new president places a hand on a Bible. That's not in the Constitution, it's just a vibe that stuck. George Washington added it, probably for drama. Every president since followed, even the ones with famously shaky church attendance. But here's the irony. While DC is the control room of global power, many Americans distrust it deeply. Polls show confidence in Congress hovers somewhere between root canals and parking tickets. Presidential approval whiplashes with every tweet or inflation report. Supreme Court decisions spark protests, and every 4 years half the country believes the world might end if the other guy wins. This isn't new. America was born suspicious of power. The founders didn't want kings. They wanted checks, balances, friction, and they got them, maybe more than they ever imagined. Yet, despite the dysfunction, Washington still makes the calls. When there's a pandemic, Congress funds the response. When war breaks out, the president deploys. When a bank collapses, or a tech monopoly grows too loud, or a spy balloon drifts too far, Washington gets the call, and the rest of the world watches. Because when DC sneezes, global markets catch colds. At diplomatic summits, US envoys carry enormous weight. Their words signal shifts, their presence implies alliances, and their absence, alarming. Even when Washington doesn't command, it shapes. It creates the environment, the rules, the options. And in a world full of unstable regimes, America's government, slow, loud, gridlocked though it may be, is still a magnet for stability. That's the strangest part. Power that seems chaotic at home somehow produces consistency abroad. It may look like a mess, but it's a mess that still moves satellites, writes checks, sets norms, launches probes, negotiates ceasefires, and sometimes, just sometimes, gets something profoundly right. Because even with all its cracks, contradictions, and cable news chaos, Washington, D.C. is still the command center of Earth's longest-running, highest-budget experiment in global influence. And every morning, it wakes up and tries again. Let's be honest, if America has a guilty pleasure, it's war. Not always full-scale, not always boots on the ground, but conflict in some form has been a near constant in US foreign policy. And while war has never been America's official brand, it's definitely been its default setting more often than most would like to admit. But here's the thing. Post 9/11, the definition of war changed. The 20th century had clear battlefields, uniforms, declarations, but the 21st, not so much. Welcome to the era of the forever wars, a blur of counter-terrorism, surveillance, covert ops, and abstract objectives. It starts, of course, with Afghanistan. US forces first entered in 2001 to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban. It was supposed to be quick. It wasn't. Years passed, presidents changed, troops rotated, goals morphed. Rebuild the country, train local forces, protect human rights, prevent safe havens. Mainstream historical fact: America's war in Afghanistan lasted 20 years, the longest in US history. It cost over $2 trillion, claimed more than 170,000 lives, combatants and civilians combined. And still, when US troops finally left in 2021, the Taliban retook power in 11 days. Let that sink in. Quirky, heartbreaking detail. The US spent millions building gas stations in remote provinces for cars that didn't exist, using fuel that wasn't available. Then there's Iraq. The 2003 invasion, based on weapons that didn't exist, turned into a power vacuum that unleashed insurgencies, sectarian violence, and later ISIS. The Islamic State wasn't just a terror group, it was a brand, a franchise of fanaticism that used American weapons, social media, and even GoPro footage to recruit, conquer, and terrorize. At its peak, ISIS held territory the size of Britain. It created a real-life dystopia where ideology and violence fused into a horror show. And yes, the US helped destroy it, but the scars remain. Historians still argue whether the war on terror reduced threats or simply rearranged them. Because here's what the Forever War actually looked like. Drone strikes in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen. Black sites in countries with names you rarely hear on the news. Special forces operations too classified to confirm, too big to ignore. Contractors doing things that soldiers legally couldn't. An intelligence budget bigger than the GDP of some nations, and all of it, technically war. But without the formalities, this new model blurred lines between war and peace, combatants and civilians, truth and necessity. It operated in the shadows, often with bipartisan approval. While Americans debated healthcare, somewhere a drone circled a village. Quietly, constantly, quirky fact. At one point, the US Air Force was launching a drone strike every hour. Each one required dozens of people, pilots, lawyers, analysts. Each one carried consequences no algorithm could fully predict. Meanwhile, back home, a strange contradiction brewed. The country was at war, but didn't feel like it. No rationing, no draft, no nightly casualty counts on TV. Most Americans went years without thinking about the wars, unless they knew someone deployed. The military and civilian worlds became separate galaxies. And yet, the surveillance did come home. After 9/11, the US didn't just build walls abroad, it built networks at home. Airport security tightened, phone records were logged. Metadata became currency. The phrase national security could justify almost anything, and for a while, most people accepted it. Then came whistleblowers. Edward Snowden revealed mass surveillance on a global scale, domestic and international. Americans learned their government had been collecting data on their calls, clicks, and cloud storage. Allies learned they'd been monitored too. Cue global backlash. Cue shrugs. Cue silence. And yet, the system rolled on. So how did all this war, and the way it was waged, shape America's global role? First, it maintained dominance. Bases expanded. Partnerships deepened. US forces became more interoperable with allies than ever before. It wasn't just one country doing everything. It was the quarterback for global security. Second, it shifted perception. Some saw the US as protector, others as meddler, and many, especially in the Middle East, saw it as occupier. Even after the troops left, the war on terror became a fog of broken states and blurred morals. Third, it birthed an entire economy. Defense contractors thrived. The military-industrial complex, once a warning from Eisenhower, became standard operating procedure. Entire towns, universities, and tech firms grew rich off government contracts. And the tech, let's just say war builds innovation. Drones, AI, cybersecurity, facial recognition, all accelerated by military budgets. The same tools used in Baghdad became tools for airport check-ins, warehouse logistics, even your iPhone's face unlock. That's the uncomfortable truth. War isn't just destruction, it's investment. But investment in what? The forever wars left Americans questioning the point of it all. What was won? What was lost? Did any of it make us safer, stronger, or just different? In the end, the legacy of this era isn't just measured in battles. It's measured in the families with 3 generations of deployments, the veterans with medals and PTSD, the nations forever shaped by American firepower and ambition, the policies passed in fear that outlasted the threat. And yet, through it all, America didn't collapse, didn't shrink, didn't pull back. It adapted. Again, because even when its wars drifted into silence, its influence marched on, in embassies, satellites, spreadsheets, and servers. The war might be endless, but so it seems is the empire. By the mid-2010s, America had fought its way through 2 wars, survived a financial crisis, invented half the internet, and turned cultural influence into something close to gravitational pull. But power, as every empire learns, doesn't just come from what you can do, it also comes from what you can withstand. So now we enter the era of shocks, and how America absorbed them without falling apart. First came the Great Recession. We touched on this already, But it's worth a second look, not just as an economic story, but as a resilience test. Mainstream historical fact: between 2007 and 2009, the US lost over 8 million jobs. Major banks failed, housing collapsed, global markets spiraled, and yet the dollar got stronger. Why? Because in times of chaos, people still trusted the American financial system more than almost anything else. Even when Wall Street caused the mess, the world bet on Washington to clean it up. But the wounds were deep. A generation of Americans lost homes, pensions, trust, and that loss helped set the stage for something else: populism. Both on the left and right, anger boiled. Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party rallies. The system, many believed, was rigged. For the rich, for the well-connected, for the tech giants and corporate ghosts who never seemed to face consequences. Into that storm stepped Donald Trump. Say what you will, love him, hate him, meme him. The man tapped into something real: a hunger for disruption, a suspicion of expertise, a craving for clarity in a blurry age. His win in 2016 wasn't just a political victory, it was a rupture in the idea that American power always followed a certain script. Suddenly, the script was gone. Rewritten on Twitter, shouted from podiums, fact-checked into oblivion, and still believed. Historians still argue whether this was the beginning of decline, or just a natural backlash against a global elite that had frankly gotten a bit smug. Quirky but telling fact: during Trump's presidency, global trust in US leadership dropped to record lows, but US tech companies grew. While the political brand took hits, the cultural and commercial brands marched on. Which brings us to crisis number 2, COVID-19. If 9/11 showed America's vulnerability to attack, COVID revealed its vulnerability to everything else: health infrastructure, supply chains, political cohesion, and yes, collective empathy. The virus didn't care about passports or GDP. It spread everywhere, but the US, despite being one of the wealthiest nations in history, struggled. Hospitals overflowed, mask debates raged, misinformation swirled, leadership wobbled. And yet from that chaos came something quietly astonishing: vaccines. Fast, effective, homegrown. Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, American companies, working with international scientists, rolled out vaccines in under a year. It was a moon landing moment, just without the flags. The pandemic revealed a central truth: America's power doesn't just live in Washington, it lives in innovation. In labs, in logistics, in the terrifyingly efficient ability to go from concept to global rollout in months. But the shocks didn't stop. 2020 also brought George Floyd's murder, and the largest protest movement in US history. Millions marched, statues fell, police budgets were debated, and once again, the world watched. Not because America was righteous, but because it was raw, exposed. Other nations looked at their own injustice, reflected in America's mirror. That's the strange echo of US influence. When it breaks down, everyone feels it. When it stumbles, others examine their own footing. And yet through recession, through plague, through protests and tweets and impeachment trials, America still functioned. Elections happened, vaccines shipped, courts ruled, people voted, innovators coded. Why? Because American power isn't just about perfection, it's about plasticity. Like a building built to sway in earthquakes, the US bends where others might crack. It doesn't always bend gracefully. It doesn't always reform quickly, but it moves. That's a kind of strength. Quirky fact: during the darkest moments of 2020, while everything seemed to be unraveling, American companies still led the world in patents. Even while staggering, it kept making the future. And that's the kicker. America doesn't rise because it never fails. It rises because it builds infrastructure for reinvention. Elections, protests, social media rants, startup accelerators, federal grants, Ivy League think tanks, garage bands that become revolutions. The empire isn't just a government, it's an idea machine. A glitchy idea machine. So yes, the 21st century has humbled the US. It's exposed flaws, deepened divides, and made the illusion of invincibility crumble. But the center still holds. Markets still watch the Fed. Armies still model after the Pentagon. Diplomats still wait for the White House to speak. And kids everywhere still dream, in some corner of their minds, about going to Los Angeles, or New York, or Seattle, or somewhere with Wi-Fi and an idea. Because even as it limps, America still leads, not just with power, but with possibility. And possibility, it turns out, is the rarest power of all. Imagine this: the US financial system nearly collapses in 2008, causes ripples through every other economy on Earth. And yet somehow the dollar gets stronger. That's not just economic gravity, that's structural supremacy, baked deep into how the world moves money. Welcome to America's most unshakable pillar of power, finance. While military might builds bases and tech shapes attention, financial dominance is the quiet engine that keeps America's empire humming, often invisibly. Because when you run the bank, you don't have to shout, "Let's break it down." Mainstream historical fact. Roughly 90% of global foreign exchange transactions involve the US dollar. Not because everyone loves George Washington's face, but because the dollar is the trust anchor of modern capitalism. It's the default, the global safe zone. Even countries that don't like the US still trade in dollars. Why? Because it works, it's fast, it's stable, and it's everywhere. Now, how did we get here? Start with Bretton Woods, 1944. A post-war conference where the US, already emerging as a financial juggernaut, basically said, let's make the dollar the center of everything. Other countries agreed, partly because the US held 2/3 of the world's gold at the time. Seems persuasive. Then, in 1971, Nixon unpegged the dollar from gold. Experts warned of chaos. It didn't happen. Instead, the dollar just kept being the dollar. Its dominance was no longer backed by shiny metal. It was backed by confidence, consistency, and the size of the US economy. It's not just about greenbacks, though. It's about institutions. The US hosts the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and SWIFT clearing access. It influences global lending rules. It pressures currencies. It determines who gets loans, who gets bailouts, and critically, who gets punished. Enter sanctions. When the US wants to hurt a government without military action, it turns to sanctions. And when it does, the results can be brutal. Locked accounts, frozen assets, banks cut off from the dollar system. It's like being kicked off the world's financial internet. Quirky fact: at one point, US sanctions on Iran were so extensive that European businesses were fined just for sending emails to Iranian partners. And the weird part, no international treaty gave the US this power. It emerged organically, through trust, convenience, and sheer economic scale. Its de facto empire. Even in crisis, it holds. Take 2008. America caused the crash, but as markets panicked, investors bought US Treasury bonds. Why? Because the US, for all its flaws, is still seen as the safest place to park your money during a storm. Even China, America's biggest rival, holds over $1 trillion in US debt. Critics call that leverage, but it's mutual. If China dumps those bonds, it crashes its own economy. It's like both players holding the same grenade. Now, let's talk about Wall Street. Wall Street isn't just a physical place, it's a mindset. It's algorithms, investment banks, venture capital, high-speed trades. The stock market has become a global weather system. And guess who still sets the forecast? Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, Google, Amazon. These are not just companies, they're economic planets with their own orbits. If Apple sneezes, factories in Taiwan catch colds. If the Fed raises interest rates, currencies in Brazil or Nigeria might tremble. And the Federal Reserve is, arguably, the most powerful central bank on Earth. It controls the supply of dollars. It can make money cheaper or more expensive, with a few words. Entire governments tune in for Jerome Powell's tone of voice. Historians still debate whether this financial dominance is stable or a house of cards, propped up by legacy and luck. But here's the tricky part. There's no obvious replacement. The euro. Strong, but Europe is fragmented. The yuan, rising, but controlled by a non-transparent government. Bitcoin, too volatile, too slow, and still used more often for memes than mortgages. That's the American edge. Not perfection, but scale, trust, and inertia. Quirky truth. Even criminals prefer the dollar. The DEA once said bulk cash smuggling of US bills was a favorite for drug cartels, simply because the dollar is easier to spend anywhere. And while the future may include digital currencies, the US is already prepping central bank digital currency under study. Crypto regulation? On the way. Silicon Valley's already prototyping the next version of finance, and guess where the patents are filed? Which brings us to a final thought. Finance is boring until it's not. Until a war breaks out and sanctions hit. Until a crash shatters savings. Until inflation eats through paychecks. That's when financial power becomes existential. And right now, no nation on earth has more control over that lever than the United States. It doesn't just make money, it makes the rules of money. That's not just empire, that's economic gravity. So when people say America's in decline, check the bank wires, follow the funds. Look at where investors flee when things fall apart. Odds are, they're still headed for the dollar. By now, it's clear, America's rule isn't about land alone, or just military bases. It's a tangled web of ideas, money, tech, and culture, all interwoven, constantly shifting. But to understand how the US actually holds the crown, you have to look at something deeper and more invisible. Ideology. Because America's global dominance is as much about what it means to be American as what it can do. Let's start with the most basic belief. Freedom. From the Declaration of Independence onward, freedom has been America's rallying cry. But freedom isn't simple or singular. It's contested, messy, paradoxical. Freedom to worship, to speak, to assemble. Freedom to own guns. Freedom from government intrusion. Freedom for corporations to operate. Freedom from oppression. Freedom to be. That powerful, elastic idea spread around the world, sometimes as liberation, sometimes as chaos. Mainstream historical fact. The US fought 2 world wars, partly to make the world safe for democracy, and then spent decades promoting democracy as a foreign policy goal. From Korea to Bosnia, from Iraq to Ukraine, the idea of free elections became a US export. But democracy is complicated. Not every country wants the same democracy. America does. Some want more order, less noise. Others want a system that works, not just one that looks like it works. And America's brand of democracy has often been criticized for being messy, polarized, and riddled with inequalities. Quirky fact, in 2020, voter turnout in the US hit 66%, the highest in over a century, but still far below many other democracies where 80% or more vote. Next, consider the concept of exceptionalism. Americans have long believed their country is different, unique in mission and morality. The idea that the US is the city upon a hill, a light to the world, a nation chosen for greatness. This belief fuels ambition and resilience, but also arrogance and blind spots. It can justify intervention abroad and dismiss critique at home. Historians still debate whether American exceptionalism is a unifying myth or a dangerous delusion. Probably both. Then there's capitalism, the economic ideology underpinning US power, not just markets and money, but the idea that innovation, competition, and private ownership drive progress. That wealth is a sign of merit. That opportunity is abundant. This ideology has shaped everything from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. It's produced incredible wealth, but also inequality. The American dream promises mobility, but sometimes delivers stagnation. The tension between freedom and equity is baked into American life and into its global influence. Meanwhile, America's soft power relies heavily on storytelling. Hollywood movies, political speeches, cultural exports that cast the US as hero, underdog, innovator. Narratives like saving the world in WWBA or spreading democracy during the Cold War have shaped international perceptions. But these stories are often contested, rewritten by those on the receiving end. Quirky cultural note. The phrase American dream wasn't popularized until the 1930s, during the Great Depression, when it was needed most. a kind of hope in hard times. This ideology doesn't just float in the ether, it's actively taught, debated, protested, revised, and the internet changed the game. Ideas spread faster than armies. Movements rise and fall in hashtags. Misinformation muddles truths. Cultural influence is no longer a one-way street. It's a global dialogue. In sum, America's power is as much about conviction as confrontation. It's about a country that believes in itself enough to make others believe too. And that belief? It's messy. Sometimes inspiring, sometimes infuriating. But it's been the secret source of US dominance since day one. By now, the idea of America's global role might feel like a sprawling epic, with no clear ending. But every story, especially one about power, has a dark twin. The consequences, the fallout, the part that makes you pause and ask, at what cost? So let's look at the limits and costs of American dominance. First, there's the toll at home. The US spends more on its military than the next several countries combined. Yet, domestically, infrastructure ages, education struggles, and healthcare remains an uphill battle. The military-industrial complex is massive, but so are social inequalities. Mainstream historical fact: the US has the highest incarceration rate in the world, over 2 million people behind bars, disproportionately people of color. This shadow of empire is deeply tied to domestic policy and history, and those wars abroad, they leave scars, not just on the battlefield, but in families and communities. Then, there's global blowback. America's interventions have sometimes destabilized regions. Think Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Sometimes they've created power vacuums filled by extremists. Sometimes they've fueled resentment that leads to terrorism. The idea that America is a liberator is complicated by the reality that it's often seen as a bully or occupier. Anti-American sentiment isn't a relic, it's active and vocal worldwide, quirky but sobering. The US has over 800 military bases in about 70 countries, more than any other nation. That's not just presence, it's footprint. It breeds influence and suspicion in equal measure. There's also the challenge of sustainability. The US economy and military depend heavily on fossil fuels. Climate change threatens everything from coastal cities to global food systems. America is both a leader in innovation and a major emitter. This contradiction weighs heavily on its global image. And then there's soft power fatigue. Cultural exports that once dazzled now compete with growing national pride movements worldwide. American stories compete with Bollywood, K-pop, Nollywood, and rising voices from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The monopoly is fracturing. Historians still debate whether the US can maintain dominance in an increasingly multipolar world, or whether the very notion of empire is outdated. The answer is murky. But what is clear is that America's global power has always been a balancing act, a constant negotiation between ideals and interests, between generosity and self-preservation, between dreams and realities. And it's an act performed not just by presidents and generals, but by millions of everyday people who vote, innovate, protest, and build. The United States story isn't finished. It's evolving. And as the 21st century unfolds, that evolution might be the most American thing of all. And here we are, the final stop on this winding journey through the saga of America's global rise. A story tangled with ambition, contradiction, innovation, and resilience. The United States didn't inherit a world ready to be ruled. It shaped one, often clumsily, sometimes brilliantly, and always with a kind of stubborn, unyielding energy. America's power isn't just in weapons or money. It's in stories told around kitchen tables and on global stages, in music that crosses oceans, in technologies that connect billions, and in ideas sometimes messy, sometimes inspiring, that challenge us all to rethink what power means. Mainstream historical fact: the US has never been a perfect nation. Its flaws are baked into its foundation: slavery, inequality, broken treaties. Yet its strength has often been the willingness to wrestle with those contradictions, to strive toward ideals even when falling short. The quirky reality: much of America's influence feels accidental, a series of experiments and happy mistakes that grew into something colossal. A country that began with 13 colonies, birthed on revolution, now steering the globe in ways no founding father could have imagined. And as empires rise and fall like tides, America's legacy may be less about control and more about influence, an ongoing conversation with the world, sometimes a tug of war, sometimes a dance. It's a story of constant reinvention, messy debates, fiery protests, and quiet hope. So as we dim the lights, let the last images fade, of skyscrapers, of battlefields, of internet cables snaking under oceans, of protest signs raised in the streets, of rocket launches piercing the night sky. Remember this: America's rule over the world isn't a finished chapter, it's an unfinished story, still being written by millions, in countless ways, every day. And maybe, just maybe, that's what power really looks like. Not a throne to sit on, but a story to keep telling. Word count 1078. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. End of script. Sweet dreams.